Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.
Hi, I'm David Manti, and welcome to a new episode of the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. With me this week is Jace Goodrow, Vice President of Growth at Deep Roots Harvest. Thank you very much for joining me today, Jace.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you for having me, David.
Before we get started, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You can also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com with email the podcast in the subject line. You can also subscribe to our daily newsletter. Make sure you get it delivered to your inbox first. Jace, I always like to start the podcast with a little bit of background. How was it that you found yourself working in cannabis?
Yeah, so interesting story, David, that, it goes back to probably about as early as you can get into cannabis, right? So, as a kid, I grew up, I was kind of born and really raised in Humboldt County.
Oh, wow.
So, when you think about cannabis, I think they kind of go hand in hand back in the that era, right? So, I kind of grew up there. I went all the way through all of my elementary, high school. And when you think about the industries that kind of exist in Humboldt County, there's not very many, and one of them happens to be cannabis back then. And so, I think you're pretty much surrounded by it, so I think that that was something that I started fairly early, let's say, my early teenage years, we were pretty involved in cannabis, meaning I consumed cannabis, pretty much on a daily basis. And it was kind of like, that's what you did. You didn't have a lot of options up there. So, I knew that was something I enjoyed, personally from the medicinal side, but I also enjoyed it just from the personal use side as well. And I think for myself, I saw like, hey, this is something that maybe I wanted to continue to do, but didn't really know how, because this was obviously still, pre, Proposition even 215. And so, I was like, okay, well, I was in, high school bit during that period, and was like, okay, like any high school, consumed cannabis and enjoyed it. And all my friends did. And that was kind of what that market looked like up there. So, I got into the other side of it further down as I went to school down in Central California, and, continued to enjoy my cannabis use from a recreational side. I got my medical card in the late 90s. And, so what I did is I was like, okay, well, I'm going to head my way over to Nevada and make my way to Las Vegas. And I remember going into Las Vegas, the funny part of it is there used to be a sign in the early 2000s, at least when I came over, 2002. And, the sign said, "Don't gamble on marijuana," and it would get you 20 years. And I was like, oh, this state's maybe not the state for me, because I was pretty involved at that period in the cannabis side of stuff. And so I got over here, and then I started my career in traditional brick and mortar type retail, so I worked in, companies like Guess Inc., where I worked about 10 or 11 years for them and doing, day-to-day brick and mortar retail things, where I learned the daily fundamentals of selling and marketing strategies and business acumen, et cetera. And, grew that into, district managers and training managers, et cetera, and kind of did a lot of that, and made my way to companies like True Religion brand jeans. I worked at Michael Kors. I worked for brands, and then I wanted to move into more of the luxury side of things. I worked in, a company called Maris, and we did partnerships with the Fairmont and Four Seasons hotels, where we did boutiques internationally for that. And then, lastly, I got into, I was with the LVMH brand and on the Dior side. So pretty luxury when I was finishing out that. So I did about 16 years or so of that. And then I got a call, from someone that I'd worked with previously in, my traditional retail career. And they called me and said, "Hey, would you ever be interested in cannabis?" And I was like, pretty interesting, because believe it or not, I never really could talk about it before. Right. And there was always the stigma, and there was always this thing, and especially in the business I was in, and, you weren't able to speak about it. And it was always something I'd been passionate about and something I'd always believed in, but they just couldn't really talk about it from a professional side. So I kind of always just kept that, kind of within. And then, as these opportunities came up, and I got an opportunity to kind of run the West Coast for MedMen. So I got a call from someone I previously worked with. And, I was like, I'm going to take a risk. This is something I believed in. I believed in it as a kid. I grew up around it. I was very involved in it as a kid. My family was involved in it. That's kind of like what everybody kind of did. And I'd always been passionate about it, but I couldn't really obviously make a living doing it. Right. So, I got an opportunity in 2018 when Nevada went recreational. And, I'd had a lot of experience doing multi-store, multi-state, et cetera. And so they were like, hey, this is kind of new to everybody, but you have some leadership skills and people skills. And we think a lot of the blocking and tackling is going to look the same. And so I got an opportunity to run most of the West Coast for them. So Arizona, California, and Nevada, based in Nevada here. And so I had a good run there. Obviously, with that business, there was quite the interesting, dynamic, let's just say, over time. But I was there for 4 or 5 years. And when I left them, I was the vice president of retail, where I oversaw all of their locations for the US. So then, I did that for about almost 5 years, and then got a call from Air Wellness, and transitioned over there, where I was there. I just recently left them, and to come over to the Deep Root side. So I was there for about 3 years as a vice president of retail for them as well, running multiple states as well. So and then been with the Deep Roots and the Source team, for the last 3 months here. So based in Nevada, and super excited about what the future looks like for this group. But that's kind of the Cliff Notes version of my cannabis. So kind of was born into it with some DNA, I guess, if you will, into it, and slowly took some of the professional, retail side of things, the marketing strategies, the procurement and purchasing strategies, and kind of, transitioned a lot of that over to the cannabis, and saw what worked and what didn't, so.
We always hear about growing up in a factory town, a steel town, or a mining town. What was it like growing up in a cannabis town?
Yeah. I think it's interesting enough, because I've been asked this before. You just don't really realize it, right? I mean, there's logging, there's fishing, there's some dairy and cattle ranching, and then there was cannabis. I mean, so realistically, everybody around you did about 4 or 5 options. That was it. So it wasn't uncommon to go to a little league game, and you had a rancher next to a logger, next to a person who was in the cannabis industry, right? And I think because it was so, I think it's because how everybody kind of made a living. No one really saw it as anything besides, hey, they're just trying to get by, And so for all of us, like, it was kind of very normal to see and be around it so much. And, I think everyone was just trying to make sure that they could make ends meet. And no one kind of really kind of batted an eye with it, right? And I mean, yes, there was obviously, I was in the, elementary school, the early 90s. So there was DARE and all these things where you're like, okay. But at the same time, I think, people were just trying to make it. And I think when there isn't a lot of industries, and everybody around you is like I said, when you go to school with the same kids, the kids I went to kindergarten with is the same kids I graduated high school with. You knew what the families were, you knew what they were about. And I think it was more just about the people. It's a very small town and community up there. And so for me and myself, it was very normal, and we normalized it, right? I think that when I got out of Humboldt County is when I started to be like, wait a minute, this is not exactly what I thought it would be like, because I just assumed everybody was kind of like okay with it, and in the consumption of cannabis, right? So it was definitely interesting as I moved out of Humboldt County.
When you were working with MedMen, when did you first realize that things were starting to get interesting?
I think when I was there in 18, 19, 20, I think really after COVID, is when I started to see some, a chip in the armor. I could see some of the spending, and, just being in a pretty buttoned up public traded companies previously, where, obviously everything's scrutinized, and every dollar and penny is counted. And, you're really meticulous about your P&Ls and your margins and your marketing spends and your strategies. I could see that the spending was a little interesting at times, right? And I'm like, I don't know how long this is going to be able to be sustainable, right? So I started to, think about, okay, well, maybe we can raise more capital. Obviously the debt's going to get pushed out, et cetera, right? So I could start to see a little bit of a chip in the armor. I think probably after COVID is when it really started to. The licenses were getting pretty expensive. I think that they paid a lot for the licenses anyways. But I was just like, yeah, there's a lot going out and not as much coming in. And I started to put those things together.
Well, given your background, did you ever kind of raise your hand and just say, hey guys, some of this math is pretty simple. Like you have this column and this column's looking a lot bigger.
Yeah, I think at that period of time, I mean, I was still, I would say new. I think everybody was in 2018 and 19 and 20, where, the cannabis, we're still fairly new and all trying to figure it out. I was really focused on opening and kind of scaling retail, right? At that point, like how many stores can I open? And there was also I don't know how many, C-suite executives there were at that time, but there was quite a few. So I wasn't always in those rooms to kind of probably raise my hand. I'm sure some of the people in there probably saw it as well. And, there was definitely some things that I'm assuming that those individuals saw and the ownership saw. But I think that, that wasn't really in my realm. My realm was really to keep the retail focus and kind of move forward with getting as much revenue as we possibly can out of the retail locations and ensure that we had a great experience. So I think for myself, I not that I didn't say it, and maybe I had some conversations with some direct supervisors, but nothing that I think that materialized into anything.
Well, I guess that's what happens with sort of revisionist history, right? Is that, I mean, there can be a general history, but you guys did a lot of good work at MedMen. What were some of the wins that you accomplished in your role that you're particularly proud of?
Yeah, I mean, I still think that from a retail experience standpoint, visual merchandising, the ability to kind of make it as normal as you possibly could with some of the marketing and those types of things. But, I was really proud of the retail. I think when it came to, I think a lot of cannabis places, everyone was behind the desk and they kind of like come to the bud tender. And, it was kind of like, there was also a lot of at that time, a lot of locations or dispensaries at that time that were still a little bit dark and kind of like, you maybe a little bit felt a little bit awkward or sketchy into. And I think, the normalization that we were able to do there where, we made it a lot more open, a lot more inviting, a lot more of a retail feel, something that an experience where people felt they had seen it before in some of their traditional type of retail, brick and mortar businesses. And I think because of that, those are some of the things that I was pretty proud of. We put together some pretty good training programs and development programs, for people. And those are the items that I was really, really happy and excited about. And so that was probably where we felt good about hanging our hat on.
What, from your experience at both MedMen and Air, do you plan on bringing to your new role at Deep Roots?
Yeah, I think with the Deep Roots and the team is Nevada specifically is a pretty mature market. It's been around and there's a lot of people, there's a lot of folks that have been here since day one. And I think right now, it's not the old days where you have a new leader walk in the door and you get a 10% left, 20% left. It's just that's not the case, right? I think really you look at, 5 to 7 to 8 initiatives that you try to do, maybe it's 5 to 7 initiatives. And you try to, I tell the team, you try to tighten the bolt about a half a turn on all of those, and if you can do that well, and you can do that in those, those items, whether it's, margin, whether it's, some retail revenue, whether it's, GP dollars, whether it's operational efficiency, whether it's labor costs, whether it's marketing, whether it's, those different types of things, I think you can, eke out a little bit more EBITDA here and there. And, so I think that's really what I'm trying to focus on with the team is, streamlining from like all, not really be a really good operator when it comes to the retail side of things and really make sure that we're leaning into the things that we can, start to see the numbers move on. I think everybody tries to do everything. And I think, we only need to do a few things really, really well. And I think you'll start to see some, material numbers and incremental numbers come out of that. So I think there's that. I think the other thing too is that when you're in a mature industry and even here is what I've seen is we're all selling the same products, right? And when you all sell the same stuff and you're all competing on the same promotions, let's say they might be different days at times, the thing that you can start to do to separate and be a differentiator for you is the experience, right? And so that's one thing that from my standpoint that I've really been in the few months I've been here is how do we start to separate ourselves when it comes to a retail experience, right? As I go and I meet with the procurement team or the purchasing team or the marketing teams or the retail teams, I'm asking questions such as, how did that impact the customer's experience today? What is looking through the lens of the customer's experience? Did that make an impact? What did that feel like for them today? So I think those are some of the things that I try to think about a little bit differently where, I think that if you didn't have a retail background or you didn't have an experiential background and you're like, okay, well, we need to run more promotions or we need to do more of those. I'm a little bit less like, yeah, we have to have good promotions and we have to have good strategies and we have to have good pricing. But at the same time, like we also need to, there's not a lot of extra customers coming in, so if you're all jockeying for the same amount of customers, then what you really need to do is make sure you're impacting those ones. And if there's not a lot of new customers for new customer acquisition, then you got to increase frequency. And so those are some of the things that we're trying to look at differently from a data standpoint as well.
So what are the first few bolts that are going to get that half turn in order to expand revenue?
I think one of the first things we needed to do is SKU rationalization overall. I think that we had a lot of SKUs that were not accretive to, either the margin side of things or just from a unit velocity standpoint. So that was one of the first things that we started to do is look at the SKU rationalization. Do we have the right assortment, for the customer? What is moving the needle and what's not? What's kind of just taking up shelf space? And what is really driving customers into the stores, right? Because we could have the best customer experience there is, but if we're still not driving them, then, we need to make sure that we have the right, procure the right menu for the customers. And so we've really kind of honed in on those things. Do we have the right, let's say, a good, better, best option for them? And really kind of making sure that we can meet wherever that customer is on their journey in shopping, whether it's a value customer, someone who's looking for mid-tier, someone who's looking for kind of the best of the best. Like, do we have those options, right? So there's one thing. And I think the other thing is then leaning into our vendors on making sure that we're getting prices that are going to allow us to be the most competitive in the market, right? And again, I don't think that it's from the standpoint as I work with the vendors on is that we're not looking to put the margin back in the pockets of ourselves. We're really trying to give it back to the customer to ensure that they feel they're getting the most value for the product that they're looking for. And so those are some of the things in the bolts that we're tightening. I think also from a margin or from a marketing standpoint, it's really looking at segmentation. I think a lot of times, in marketing, we cast really wide nets and try to grab everything. And that's not and I think sometimes you catch a lot of everything and that's not always impactful, right? And it costs a lot of money. So I think it's being a little bit more surgical, and really being a lot more looking at segmentation of our audiences, and making sure that when we are, really trying to, look at a, specific kind of, campaign, what's the value of the campaign? Is it moving the needle or are we just doing it because we think it looks good? So using the data and then really making sure that we're focused on the audiences where we can lean on them a little bit more. And then looking at the audiences where, maybe we weren't as good at previously. So those are some of the things that we're doing, procurement. Again, the menus, we got to always be looking at our menus. There's a lot of, people that are coming in from California, not only just customers, but vendors as well. And kind of our partners and making sure that we have some of the best of the new people that are coming into town. So we're always looking at menu opportunities. And then from the retail to go back to is, just some basic framing of what does retail look like? Like, what does the experience look like? What does our greetings look like? What does our, bud tender education look like? So those are some of the things that we're really trying to get back to and then not overcomplicate a very, very simple thing, and really trying to be the best at in a customer experience. And that means from a lot of different areas, from a marketing, procurement, purchasing, and retail standpoint.
What is SKU rationalization? How do you get started and what does the process look like?
So I think the way that we first got started is any SKU that really wasn't hitting a bar that we had set, whatever that bar was for the category. And, whether it's a gummy, whether it's flour, whether it's concentrate, whether it's a vape, like what is kind of our bar, from a margin perspective. And then we asked ourselves, okay, what's the unit velocity of that? What is this product really driving traffic, or is this product really driving revenue? Is this really driving margin? Like what is the objective of this SKU? And then we kind of went down it and said, okay, well, this SKU might not do anything for us. And we're kind of carrying it because we said that we've always carried it. Maybe that was just some of the things. We just always carried it. And then maybe some of the other things is maybe it's a relationship that they had in the past where it's like, okay, well, just, do we need to carry all their SKUs? Maybe we have a brand portfolio, but we don't need to carry every single SKU within that brand. And so it was just kind of tightening that up. And then as we discovered which ones which ones did or didn't hit the mark, then we started to open that up with conversations with these vendors and said, hey, unfortunately, we're running, discounts around this percentage. And, for us to really ensure that we can move the velocity and that product's not sitting there, which is not good for either party, us or the company over there, the brand, how do we make sure that we can get the best pricing to move the units that are needed? Really, I think we need to be priced here because we're going to have to discount it to here to make sure we get the velocity movement. And, obviously some, the brands are not willing to budge. Some are absolutely like, yep, we totally get it, and that makes sense. And, so I think that we have to decide, what the goal of each one of those SKUs are within each category, right? So, and sometimes that means shrinking your menu. I don't think you always need to have like really wide menus and not, I would rather be a little bit more narrow and deep. If you know what you're selling and, you can lean into a little bit more of those and make sure you're never out, you'd be surprised on, 20 to 30% of your SKUs are driving, 70 to 80% of your revenue. And so it's about making sure you can take your spending and really invest in things that are going to make movement. And, I think that starts with good SKU rationalization.
No, that was throughout that process. Were there any surprises for you or other people on staff where, maybe you thought something was performing better than it was, or something was actually performing like, much worse than they thought, given the brand name or any sort of influence or affiliation?
Yeah, there always is. There's, don't want to probably speak on specific brands necessarily, but in even categories, I think I could speak about a category where you're like, I'll use vapes. Vapes, I came in and I was like, I think vapes are a little bit underperforming. And then I started to dig in and you're like, oh, we're missing this brand. We're missing this brand. What happened? It's like, oh, well, we've never really talked to them. And I'm like, actually, you can go to your other, headset, BDSA, all of these things and be like, look at this brand's ranking in the top 2 or 3. Like, we got to go pick them up. But what happened or why didn't we? So I think there's some good wins and learnings there to I think a lot of times people, in cannabis, and maybe more so in the beginning than now, is they use their gut and it was a little bit more emotional. I think as you start to use more data-driven items, I think you start to really go, wait a minute, like there's something left there. And I think maybe we need to lean into it, or maybe we need to expand. Maybe we're only buying 5 SKUs from them and they have 4 others that we never picked up. Why not? So I think as you start to do that, you start to learn if the brand is really carrying it, or is it the SKU that's really carrying it, or maybe it's one SKU. You would not believe on CBN gummy in general on how much that specific SKU moves the needle for all gummy brands, right? So I think it's interesting to be like, okay, well, do we have the best CBN SKUs? Do we have the brands that carry the best? So it's kind of going into those types of things and making sure, especially based off of where we are. If we get a pretty local customer, and if they're looking for sleep or these types of things, I think you also got to understand who your customer is and who your demographic is shopping with you, and that will kind of also help guide you on match that with some data. I think you give yourself a good shot for good SKU rationalization.
What product categories are driving the most revenue right now?
Flour. I think that flour is definitely, it's always kind of been number one. There's subsets of obviously flour. Interesting enough, we talk a lot lately, especially with the team, is the half ounce or 14 gram bag is the new eighth.
Yeah.
which, back in, the early 18, let's say 18, 19, 20 in there, it was like you had to have the best eights there were, right? You had the best eights. If you didn't have the best, like you were going to be in deep trouble. And it's actually like, I think that a lot of people have moved to, at least in these more mature markets, I'm not going to say every market, but I've seen as you're more mature, people are looking for a really, really good product in a 14 gram or half ounce or even ounce option, and I think people's, probably cannabis consumption's increased. And it's also like, they just are looking for good value. And I think there's a lot of good brands out there that you can get just a pretty good ounce deal in or half ounce deal in. And, I think people, as their consumption's increased, they're looking for value, just like anything. I think you see that more and more out there in not just cannabis, but kind of think just in all types of shopping experiences. People are looking for a little bit more value and the best brand they can get in that value.
Well, not just value, but convenience,
Yeah.
less visits.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, surprising enough, you would think that, but frequency has not stopped, right?
really? Okay.
So, that was one of our kind of like, in the very beginning, we're like, oh, well, if we give them more, then we're going to slow down their ability. The frequencies have maintained, the consumers just buying more product. They're consuming more. So, I mean, I think that's, especially in mature markets, I think people are a lot more, like, hey, I can use cannabis a lot more than what they initially intended, which is maybe just a sleeper, maybe it was just this. Like, they're really consuming a lot more from our perspective.
When you go to work with vendors, when you're negotiating pricing, do you let other vendors know, like, hey, this brand is playing ball with us, and we're obviously going to give them more shelf space in the event that you can't help or you can't meet us in the same level?
No, I try to stay away from that.
Yeah.
I think that this, the industry is still built on a lot of good relationships. And I think it's very, very small industry. Right.
Hmm.
And I'm not I personally don't try to put brands against each other. That's not my goal. My goal is like, hey, this is about the customer. We know that you own this percentage of the market share. If you would want to grab more market share, I can help you with that, but I think you also got to help me with that. I can give a little bit more of a discount here. We can run more promotional events with you here. But that being said, is that we probably need better pricing. I think originally I also, try to help the vendor with like, you might give up a few points of margin percent, but if our velocity is increasing, we're going to give you back GP dollars,
Hmm.
and it's going to be a winner on both sides. So I think that's kind of how I view it, is like, let me help you and you help me type thing, and not what the other brands are doing.
Gotcha. Gotcha. You know, to that effect, though, what are some of the changes you're making to improve customer engagement, particularly in the dispensary?
Yeah, I mean, we've created just recently some auditing tools, some basic kind of like, retail auditing tools within a store. You know, we've done some goal setting with the stores where I think previously there wasn't just like, hey, here's a revenue goal, here's a margin goal, here's a GP goal, those types of things. There's an ADS goal, or average transaction or average cart goal. So there's some things that we've given goal wise. We've also done and created some audit tools where we can go into a store, and it's not so much like, hey, are you, counting cash correctly like this. It's more of like, what's the experience and feeling look like? What's the music level to what's the greeting look like? What's the education look like? So there's some things that we're really trying to do to make sure that we're giving a really good experience as well. The other thing too is that we're looking at the way we schedule a little bit differently. I think a lot of times people are like, oh, well, I work this shift to this shift to this. And we really went back and dug into the traffic and said, okay, what are our busiest days? What are our busiest hours? And are we scheduling to those hours and days on a way that kind of like, a transaction per labor hour is kind of like what we've seen is like, well, what should be our transaction per labor hour for the busiest times and days? And then really kind of updating our schedule to reflect when we need the most of our staff to meet the best experience for the people that are coming in during those times.
I was just having another conversation about the experience in the dispensary and how really not a lot of attention has been paid to that. Like just the idea of the music selection. And I'll ask the same question to you. What's the best music to have on in the dispensary.
The funny enough, I think I don't think it's a one size fit all, right?
Yeah.
I think that in the morning time, it's probably a little different than a Friday evening, right? I also think by market, right? I think that, within the, something that's probably a little bit, maybe sees a little bit more of a tourism in Vegas, it might look a little different on a Friday and a Saturday than a, location that's maybe a little bit more of your real local and closer to, a different type of demographic. So I think there's not a one size fits all. But I think that, experience, I think previously before it was like, okay, if we just have the right products and we have the best marketing with all the billboards, they're going to come in and we're going to win. And I think yeah, that probably in the beginning, yeah, I mean, that's a market share grab. I get it. I think now it's really about, how do you give the best experience? Because I'll be honest, if you're running 30% off here and the person's down running 30% off down the street, what makes that customer decide you over them? And I think that you have to win with the experience. It's things that people don't forget. I think we've all been to a restaurant where we're like, hey, the food can be great, but if the service is bad, I'm not going back. And I think that that's where we can start to differentiate ourselves. And that's really what I try to look through the lens of, not a cannabis operator, but through what the customer would expect. And if we're not meeting that, I think we have to take hard looks in the mirror at times in some of the things we're doing.
Was that a shock to you coming from your retail experience and with some of these premium brands that is very carefully curated around the customer experience? Were you surprised to find that, they weren't even close to that in cannabis?
So I thought, but the one thing that stood out, and I'll kind of go in this place, is there was this passion for cannabis that was unmatched compared to a retail environment I was in. Like the bud tender and the managers and the leads within the building cared so much about cannabis. It was like, it wasn't just they loved the brand. They literally loved the entire lifestyle. And it was something that I couldn't teach, right? Like, I mean, I could have been in a lot of different brands before where I'm like, oh, you gotta love this denim and you gotta love this footwear and they would like it, right? But they didn't have this passion where some of them, they needed the product for medicinal reasons. And some of them were just like, this is what makes me get through pain management, a million different reasons. But what I could not believe was the amount of passion that these employees had. So I think for me, it was like, okay, how do we redirect some of the passion into experiential, right? Like, how do we take and I did not want to take that away because it was something that I could not teach. It was something that was ingrained in who they were and what they believed in this product. So what I did is I was like, okay, well, how do I get them to really understand some kind of basic fundamentals and then let the passion come through and their ability to converse with any type of customer about what their favorite products were. So I kind of let them tell me what those things were and then just give them some kind of basic fundamentals. And, we started to put some things together that were pretty nice to see from an experience standpoint.
No, it's interesting how it is different from a mature market versus a new market. Because when you go into some of those new markets, I don't know, I feel like I'm going to check my safety deposit box. It's just lifeless in there. You walk up to one person at a counter and and you're just like, am I in a retail store here? It's odd to me.
Yeah, I think what we try to do is cannabis is for as much as it's medicinal and for much as it's still fun, and I think that what I don't want to try to do is put some of our bud tenders or the stores in these boxes that have to be a certain way. And I think when you allow other brands to be part of your retail experience, and these brands have spent and have amazing creative directors and marketing approaches, let them live with you in the stores. And I think their story no one can tell it better than those brands can, right? So I think for myself, I'm not just oh, it needs to feel sterile and just be about us. No, it needs to be about all of us, right? The reason that we're able to create this experience is because we offer you. And I think that they tell the story better than we can even tell it. And some of the bigger brands have just done such an amazing job and not just some of the bigger brands, even some of the very local brands have just done an amazing job of spending a ton of time understanding what they're trying to accomplish. I think in inviting that into your store in a combination with a bud tender who can be themselves, I think you create an environment where people really want to spend some time and they don't feel that sterile, what you just said,
Yeah.
so.
In practice, how do you make that happen? How do you let them live with you? Is it having a representative there? Is it merchandising?
It's both. I think that, a lot of times in environments as well, you're not able to see, you're like, well, what brands? And you can see them on a digital screen, right? But I think you need to be able to use, if you can use, display boxes, depending obviously the regulations by the state. But if you can lean in display boxes where they can touch things and, obviously, there's no product inside of them or they have ambassadors and things like that, where they can kind of see brands on the wall and you kind of invite those brands, those key brands into your store, and you allow them to be part of that experience, mixed with your bud tenders and, those types of things. I think, packaging and branding and those things, they go a long ways. So I think you kind of do it, you do it together, and you can rotate brands and you can allow them to live through display options. I think their brand ambassadors do a really good job. Obviously, they can speak to the nuts and the bolts of the product and what makes them differentiators. And then you combine that with a real good experience from a behavior standpoint in the stores. I think you kind of have a pretty good winning solution on that.
How do you take, when it comes to bud tenders, how do you take that passion for the industry and shape that into professionalism that is a more consultative sell and increasing, I guess, transaction size?
Yeah, I mean, that's the ongoing work. I think from a retail standpoint to do is it obviously is going to start with hiring. When I say hiring, I think it really starts with probably the GM or store manager of a store, right? Like they have to be able to understand who they're hiring, and they got to set the tone and make sure that they identify those talented individuals and passionate individuals in the very beginning. Because I think if you hire someone who's completely not, and you try to force them into being something that maybe doesn't fit with you, like that's the round peg in the square hole. I think it really starts with making sure that you identify talent and those individuals in the very beginning. So I think talent selection in the very beginning is key from manager, and then they should help you with that. And then when you get in there, I think it's like, asking the questions like, hey, walk me through some of your favorite brands. If I was a customer coming in looking for flour, like what flour would I be buying from you and why? And so allowing them to be a little bit more natural in their selling approach. I think, we've all seen or been in an environment where they're very technical sellers. And I think when you do that, it's a little bit goes back to your sterile approach. I think nothing's better than when someone could just be natural. So asking them natural questions to kind of coach them and develop them on. And I think and having leaders who support in that kind of thing, and maybe one bud tender, identifying maybe one bud tender is not the right bud tender or for the right customer. Like really identifying, like, does this customer who wants wax and this person's a flour bud tender, like, why can't the wax bud tender help that person? You know what I mean? So it's also kind of identifying who's the best people and making sure that you support that. I think is key, and you got to do a lot of coaching. I think that. There's some old school way of me, and being in, let's say, a retail type environment for over 20 years. Like, you got to do some little role playings here. I think you got to do some coaching sessions. You got to do some, and allow some of your teams to kind of, be themselves. Though is still key. I still truly believe that.
Given the nature of the industry, has cannabis offered you or afforded you the opportunity to try things that you weren't able to try in other industries when it comes to customer experience or at the dispensary level?
Yeah, I think the one thing that definitely stands out is, coming from like a retail type environment, you don't always get to go upstream and see how it was created. You might be in a retail environment, and every once in a while, maybe you go to a place where they created some denim, right? Like where they made it, but that's very, very few, far in between. But when you're in the cannabis, you get to go all the way upstream. I mean, you get to see it from like, inception. And I think so, you get to see from the beginning to the end, and watching the care of each individual that you have the cultivator who's just so passionate about the plant, and then it moves in obviously to, the production side of things. So you have all these people that are so passionate about every single place that they're doing. And as a person who's all the way downstream on the more revenue side or the growth side, you get to see it, how passionate people are in the beginning, where I think in my past, I didn't get to see that. So it's pretty cool to be able to go and sit and walk through a cultivator and have him be as passionate as I am about an experience, right? So I go and I'm like, okay, we got to give the best experience. And what does that look like? Marketing, procurement, etc. But then I get to go to a cultivation and I get to see him care just as much about the clones and the strains and, obviously the grams per square foot that he might produce, or the potency, whatever it might be. I think for my perspective, it's pretty amazing to be able to see those passionate individuals. I mean, cannabis is got this, it's got such passionate people, and it's so contagious when you're around that it makes, me want to get up and fight every day to obviously, move the needle forward in this industry. But I get to be surrounded with people who are inspiring and motivating with their craft. And, I think that's not always the case in my past. I think people did it because they had a good living or they enjoyed pieces of it. But I think, you get to walk in and people are really passionate about a lot of different parts of this industry.
Have you used any of that storytelling? I know that some brands and other companies have told the story of the cultivator, the people behind the genetics. Is that part of the retail experience?
Yeah, I think, we need to do a better job of that. And I don't think, and I say we meaning like the retail side of things, right? Like bringing in the storytelling. Cannabis growing up and, and I told you being from Humboldt, I mean, 13, 14, 15, a lot of storytelling happens, right? And when you're consuming a joint with someone and you're passing it back and forth, and I don't think that needs to change, right? I think you can bring a cultivator in and, really let them be kind of the lead singer sometimes, not only to your bud tenders, but to the customer if they choose. So I think that's probably the next step of really giving a really good quality kind of full story of the plant and the experience is like, what would be better than someone who loves product A than to speak the person who started growing the plant all the way in the beginning. So I think there's something that this industry probably needs to do a little bit better is invite their teammates, we'll call them, then cultivators into these facilities and let them to be able to be the lead singer of that brand.
How often do you take the time to interact with customers?
I try to get into stores, at least, I would love to say 2 times a week. It's probably about 1.5 to 2 times where I'm in the store for sure one day at least. I block out my schedule and really try to go, okay, I'm going to visit stores. I'm going to see stores. I want to hear what they're saying. I want to interact with the bud tenders. I want to hear what they're saying. I want to ask them, is there something we're missing? And just honestly, I think that we're pretty, we do a pretty decent job, but there's things that we miss. And I think that there's no one that's more in tune with the industry than some of our bud tenders and our leaders in the building. So really going to them and saying, hey, what's your favorite brand? Do we carry them? Do we not carry them? Hey, what are you seeing that maybe we don't? Is it, hey, baller jars, or is there, a strain or a flavor or a terpene profile that we're missing? And you'll never get a more honest answer than a bud tender. I'll tell you that, for better or for worse. Sometimes you gotta have a little bit of a thicker skin because there's no holds bar on them. But I also think you really get to hear what not only are they doing because they're kind of sometimes ahead of the curve, but probably what they're going to be telling the customer. And at the end of the day, we have to make decisions that are customer centric and not personal. And I think that we do need to spend time in the stores, all of us.
No, I think that that's really important, like making sure that the workforce feels empowered to share that type of feedback. I mean, there are so many times that a company has blind spots that they don't even know about.
Yeah.
Well, Jace, thank you so much for taking the time today. Before we get out of here, is there anything else that we might have left out or anything in particular you want to make sure the Cannabis Equipment News audience knows about you or your work at Deep Roots?
No, I think that it's, again, I appreciate the time. It's been awesome, David. So thank you for even having me. I think that it's an industry that's got to put one foot in front of the other every day. I think, as we all know, there's a lot of sometimes noise out there and distractions and stuff like that. I think for the patient and for the daily consumer and customer that we have every day, like, we really need to make sure that we're putting one foot in front of the other and focused on them and focused on what we're all here for. And I think that, everything will fall into place,
Right.
sooner or later.
Never before has there been more noise. All right.
Oh, there's quite a bit, as we all know. So,
well, Jace, thank you again. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate the time. Thank you, David.
Before we get out of here, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You could also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com with email the podcast in the subject line. You could also subscribe to our daily newsletter. Make sure you get it delivered to your inbox first. It's coming from ours. It's going to yours. There we go. For Jace Goodrow, Vice President of Growth at Deep Roots Harvest, I'm David Manti. This is the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast, and we will see you next week.
Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.